So on the eve of Halloween, Apple announced a bunch of brand new MacBook Pros and an updated iMac. Nothing has really changed in terms of design. Everything is pretty much identical to previous generations. The only thing that's really new is the MacBook Pro 14, M3, and the processor bump inside of all these new machines. Now I'm gonna start with the iMac because nothing has changed. Same ports, same cable look, same 24-inch display. The only thing that's new inside of there is the M3 processor, and the previous iMac that you could buy only came with an M1. Now the unit that I have here does have 24 gigabytes of RAM, a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD. The MacBook Pro 14 is more of a new product that uses the chassis of an older one. So this new MacBook Pro 14 can be bought with an M3, which kind of looks like the M3 Pro and M3 Max version of it, but the only difference is you cannot get the MacBook Pro 14 with base M3 and space black, and there is one less USB Type-C or Thunderbolt port, which they removed from the right-hand side. The benefit of the Pro 14 compared to the Air is you obviously get more ports, HDMI, SD card slot, and of course you get that headphone jack and 2 Type-C ports on the left. Now the MacBook Pro 16 with M3 Max is identical to the previous MacBook Pro 16 with M1 or M2 Max. The only difference is now that it comes in space black, which is a new color in their Pro lineup. Now I've gotten a lot of questions on whether the space black leans towards a proper black or a gray. So I have the space black right here on the left-hand side, and I have the M2 Max in space gray. As you can see here, the M3 Max version definitely leans towards a darker gray. It's not a black. If it was a black, it would be closer to this color in the middle, but it's a dark gray, which I think looks absolutely awesome. The other big question is fingerprints. So I haven't cleaned my space gray M2 Max in like 6 months, right? And as you can see here, you know, there's fingerprints on it. It gets a little dirty, but the color, the light color of it kind of hides it. I haven't cleaned the space black MacBook since I got it into the studio, and you can definitely see some fingerprints, but it's doing a much better job compared to fully black laptops like the Razer Blade that's currently on the market. Other things to note is that if you're gonna get fingerprints, most of them are probably gonna show up on the keyboard first because that's the blackest part of the laptop, but you also get black stickers in the box along with a black charging cord. And the other little change with the MacBook Pro 16 is you now get a 20% brighter display in SDR mode. It now goes up to 600 nits of brightness, but I do believe there's a software tool you can download for the M2 Max or M1 Max MacBook Pro 16 and get that same 20%. Now performance is very important. This is where the M3 and M3 Max excel. In Cinebench R24, which just replaced R23, single core clock speeds with the M3 and M3 Max score the highest at 140, beating out the M2 Ultra and the Lenovo Legion 9i, which is using Intel's fastest CPU they have for a laptop right now. The jump from M3 single core clock speeds is significantly higher from M2 to M3 than from M1 to M2, making this year a bigger performance jump than last year's M2 lineup. Now, multi-core speeds is where things get really interesting. The Mac Studio with M2 Ultra hits first place, as it should, considering it's an actual desktop, but AMD's fastest CPU comes in a close second. But interestingly, the new M3 Max is only 15 points behind the i9-13980HX CPU, which is absolutely insane, considering how much less power it's using and the fact that it's much quieter in a thinner chassis. The M3 Max is definitely a big jump from the M2 Max, offering up to 45% more multi-core performance, which is a massive jump overall. Cinebench R24 now tests out the GPU, and as expected, the RTX 4090 is well ahead in terms of overall GPU performance. I mean, it should be, it's an RTX 4090, but what's really interesting is the performance jump with the M3 Max. That's a 76% increase compared to the M2 Max and a 38% difference compared to the M2 Ultra. Also interesting, the GPU performance with regular M3 beats out the M1 Pro and doubles the performance of M2. Now, After Effects is definitely the most interesting benchmark so far because the M3 Max just destroys everything, including the M2 Ultra and the RTX 4090 laptops. The 120 gigabytes of RAM unified memory just plays a massive role, and the faster GPU cores push it ahead of the competition. Even the M2 Max still outperforms both Windows laptops. This just shows me how well Adobe After Effects has been optimized to use Apple's media coders, along with the Metal API. Now, what really shocked me was the Mozilla Firefox compile test, because the M3 Max was able to compile Mozilla Firefox in only 5 minutes, beating out the M2 Ultra. That's pretty substantial considering how many more CPU cores the M2 Ultra has in comparison. Now, there's a couple of things that might be happening here. Maybe Mozilla Firefox is not utilizing all the cores, and maybe Mozilla Firefox just prefers faster cores overall, which the M3 Max has. Now, when it comes to 3D work, it's the same story. This is one area where the 4090, NVIDIA GPUs in general still hold the crown. That entire industry has been built around CUDA cores, and we see about a 90% performance difference compared to the M2 Ultra. What is interesting though is the M3 Max sat behind the Ultra this time, which means more GPU cores were being used in this test compared to the others. My guess is the longer the process, M2 Ultra will perform faster, but for shorter bursts, the M3 Max will usually come out on top. Now, lately, Apple has been making a big stink about gaming on MacBooks, and it's great because they are getting better hardware-wise to play games. They still have a AAA title problem, but it looks like slowly more and more are starting to come over. Now, the first thing I wanted to test was Shadow the Tomb Raider. This is not optimized for Apple Silicon. It's being translated through Rosetta 2, but I wanted to see where these processors sat. Now, obviously, the PC gaming laptops came out on top by a long mile. I was expecting this. I mean, this is an RTX 4090 we're talking about. But interestingly, the M3 Max beat out the M2 Ultra at 1920 by 1200. I was not expecting that because the M2 Ultra has more GPU cores. But since Shadow the Tomb Raider is so CPU bound, it only makes sense. As soon as you go to QHD, the situation kind of changes. The M2 Ultra beats out the M3 Max, with obviously the PC gaming laptops still coming out on top. Now, of course, I'm not a maniac. I obviously tested out some games that were designed for Apple Silicon. Baldur's Gate 3, which is a recent title, it's a AAA game, runs on Apple Silicon. And look, if you're using an M3, not the most playable game on an M3, like only 30 frames per second and 1920 by 1200, settings set to high. You could probably play it if you don't mind dropping it down to low, really sacrificing the visual fidelity of the game, but overall, it's not really meant for the M3. The M3 Max, on the other hand, is a totally different story. At 1920 by 1200, I was able to average around 115 frames per second with the settings set to high. When you bump the settings up to QHD, Baldur's Gate becomes a little unplayable on the M3, but still playable on the M3 Max. I was averaging around 75 frames per second, which is good. Like, that is really good for a MacBook, because historically, most of these AAA titles didn't stand a chance, but we're starting to see that change slowly. Like, don't get me wrong, there's still a gap between the M3 Max and RTX 4090 playing AAA titles, but every new release, that gap is starting to get smaller and smaller and smaller. I think Apple's biggest problem right now when it comes to gaming is offering a product that's affordable. Most gamers don't spend tons and tons of money on the latest gaming rig. Like, most gamers are still using like a 1060 or an RTX 2060 from years ago. So if Apple really wants to get into gaming, then they're gonna have to create a product that's affordable for most users. Now, there's one other thing I noticed with the M3 Max MacBook Pro 16. The fans do kick on a bit sooner, and they do get louder faster compared to the previous M2 Max. Like, when I had this laptop on high power mode, the fans came on quite quickly when I was running a bunch of these tests, and it got all the way up to 53 decibels, which is quite loud for an Apple product. Now, obviously, you don't have to run it on high power mode. If you leave it on automatic, the fan noise will stay well below 50. But I just wanted to point that out because previous M2 Max and M1 Max didn't have the fans kick on as quickly as this newer version. The SSD speeds are very fast on the M3 Max. This does have the 8TB drive, so it might be unfair, but I'm noticing write speeds of over 8,000 megabytes a second, which is absolutely insane. But battery life was interesting because I haven't really been able to do a deep dive into battery life. I've only had these products for a few days so far, but everything feels very similar to the M2 Max and obviously to the MacBook Pro 13 if you're comparing it to the 14. But I'll do more of a comprehensive battery update maybe a week from now, and I'll post it on YouTube stories. So the star of the show is obviously the M3 Max. The performance uplift on this is incredible. Like, if you're coming from an old Intel MacBook Pro, your mind is going to be blown. But if you're coming from an M1 Max, I really can't answer that question for you. If you feel like your MacBook Pro with M1 Max is still fast enough for you, then hold off. Like, you don't need to get jealous about having a faster product. If it's working for you, wait it out, save the money. But if you feel like your M1 Max is starting to slow down in some of the applications you're using, then you too will be really impressed with this M3 Max. The MacBook Pro 14 is a little bit different. It's sitting in a space that I'm not comfortable with. For $1599, only getting 8 GB of RAM on a base product doesn't sit well for me. I honestly feel like the MacBook Pro 14 only exists for corporations because their employees want something pro, and that will be the cheapest pro product. If all you're doing is browsing the net, using productivity documents, or working in Microsoft Office, the M1 Air is still way more than capable. That's the one I'd go with. You'll be saving like $400 and you'll get 16 GB of RAM. If you want slightly more performance, the most I'd go up to is the MacBook Air 13 with M2. You're still saving lots of money and you still get all those benefits. Honestly, if you're looking at the MacBook Pro 14 with base M3, then you might as well just get the MacBook Pro 14 with M3 Pro. You're gonna get more RAM, 512 GB of hard drive, and obviously a lot more performance to go with it, which means the laptop itself will last you years to come. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.